This is BD World. I am Syed Shabahat Ali and you are watching Faultlines. Sri Lanka is facing one of the worst economic crises of its history. Since 1948, the country has never seen economic crisis of this scale. And what is the scale of the crisis? Imagine a country losing 30% of its currency's value in a spate of 35 days. Not only that, there are 13 hours of power cut down across Sri Lanka. The country does not have enough money to pay for its biofuels. Adversely affecting the health sector, the hospitals are running short of critical health supplies. There is a major factor of Russia and Ukraine's war that has also hit Sri Lanka in a negative manner. And how does that come? Sri Lanka was importing most of its agricultural import, that is wheat and edible oil, from Ukraine and Russia. The country is currently in a financial deficit of 10 billion US dollars. That is another $7 billion of loan that Sri Lanka needs to pay in this year, collectively making it a crisis of 17 billion US dollar, an amount too heavy for the unfortunate nation. The major financial relief so far has come only from India. That has contributed so far 2.5 billion US dollars to Sri Lanka in an aid. China and IMF are still considering what needs to be done with the request from the government of Sri Lanka. Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
The taxing geopolitical developments are sending ripple effects across the world owing to complex interdependence of world economic order. Sri Lanka's economy has hit rock bottom with protests spreading across the country over electricity outages, food and medicine shortages, and soaring prices. Demonstrations have roiled the country of 22 million despite emergency laws allowing troops to detain participants, a weekend curfew, and a brief ban on social media. Crowds have attempted to storm the homes of more than a dozen government figures, including the president's house in Colombo, where protesters torched the vehicles of security forces amid mass protests and demands for the president's resignation. Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's ruling coalition has lost its majority in parliament. At least 41 legislators from the Sri Lanka Freedom Party walked out of the alliance, whereby President Rajapaksa dissolved his cabinet and sought to form a unity government. Sri Lanka's largest opposition political alliance, the United People's Power, rejected the proposal to form unity government and urged resignation of president. The government plans to negotiate an international monetary fund bailout, and the Washington-based lender stated that it is monitoring political and economic developments in Sri Lanka very closely.
To join me from Colombo, my first guest in the program is Umesh Muramadali. He is a lecturer of economics from University of Colombo, and with him I have Mr. Shahar Anees. He is senior journalist in Economy Next from Sri Lanka, is joining me on Skype. I welcome both of you, my guests, to the program.
Hi.
Shahar, I'll be starting from you. So are these really the worst economic crises of Sri Lanka's history, as I said in my introduction?
That's right. This is the first academic crisis in 49. We have seen 19 not it this level. Uh, this food shortage, but here shortage of not only food.
I can't hear you properly, Shahar. I'll have to come back to you. So I'm coming to you, Umesh. Umesh, is this right that these are the worst financial crises of the recent history of Sri Lanka? And what we are witnessing at the moment is an unprecedented crisis of Sri Lanka's history.
It is indeed unprecedented. The reason for that being that Sri Lanka now is in a situation where the country is in a potential sovereign default. Right, so it is most likely that the government will restructure it, which is something that Sri Lanka hasn't done before throughout the post-independent era. What led to this crisis was, while the economy has had its vulnerabilities throughout the post-independent era, after the COVID hit the globe in 2020, Sri Lankan government subsequently made series of bad choices. Now, right now, what we are witnessing is the result of those choices, including tax cuts given by the government in 2019, and then the government's adamant stance of not seeking IMF assistance or restructure debt before. They were very adamant that they were not going to IMF or restructure debt. But while it was very evident that it was not possible to do so, and now we are at a situation where we find it very difficult, almost impossible, I would say, to pay debt as well as finance imports. And that is why we have fuel shortages, gas shortages, and electricity cuts almost 12 to 13 hours a day for several days.
Umesh, let me take Shahar back into the program. So, Shahar, if you just heard what Umesh said, do you agree that these financial crises had started brewing since 2019 and the government have not been able to take timely measures in this regard?
That's right. But what happened was they thought they basically managed government. So they cut the expecting to come up with a new tax, but it never COVID-19 and why the government expenditure, and they had a policy of not go to it, partly because of our the downgraded by the regulator.
Shahar, I'll have to come back to you. There is still some problem with the audio. Umesh, I'm coming back to you. So you just pointed out that there were problems since 2019. The government has not been able or was not able to take timely measures. What do you believe can be the reason for not taking the remedy extended by IMF in time?
The issue was at 2020 when COVID hit, Sri Lanka lost a significant amount of foreign currency inflows because of tourism was badly affected. So at that point, what you mentioned, the financial deficit was very high, and there was no way that Sri Lanka was financing it. So going to the IMF, you would have received a loan. More than the loan, you would be able to restructure debt. So that was a sensible thing to do, because at that moment, there was no way that Sri Lanka could continue to repay the foreign loans. So ideal way is to restructure debt and then make sure that you keep importing stuff and provide essential to the people, and, expecting that economy will recover within few years as the tourism recovers and as the shock of COVID gradually moves away. That is how it would have helped. But the reason why the government did not go to IMF, in my reading, was that the IMF policies were quite contradictory to what government adopted, particularly soon after the election, especially the tax cuts, because the tax cuts was something that IMF was strictly against. In fact, during the previous administration, there was a IMF program during which one of the key conditions of IMF was to increase Sri Lanka's tax revenue, because Sri Lanka's tax revenue was very low, right? It was one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. So that government took certain measures, but what this government did was, soon after they came to power, they revised tax cuts, and they also were quite reluctant to move towards independency of central bank. So these things, these policy contradictions, I would say, affected the government not to adapt IMF program. Also because they sort of like to portray themselves as a very strong majoritarian government. They actually got two-third power, two-third majority in the parliament 2019. So after that, going back on your tax policy after a couple of months of implementing it wouldn't look good on them, right? So that was my reading, that because of that ego and the adamant nature, they didn't go to IMF, although that was the sensible thing to do.
An important thing, Umesh, that you shared is that a primary trigger was the cut down on tourism. So how broadly does Sri Lanka rely on her tourism industry? What is the scale of this? I mean, how much of your national income was actually dependent on this sector?
I had the national income figures, but we annually, the approximate figure is around $4 billion during 2018-19. That is what Sri Lanka received. So $4 billion is a quite a large amount For Sri Lanka, to put it in the context, Sri Lanka's export earnings were about, let's say, last year 10 to 12 billion US dollars. So the tourism was a significant part of foreign currency earnings, I would say, for about 25%. So the loss of that was a significant hit to the foreign currency inflows, thereby the balance of payments.
And talking on the political angle of it, don't you think that the over stay of Rajapaksa family in power? I mean, previous president is now the prime minister, and now the president is refusing to take appropriate action since 2019, as you said. So, is it not primarily a crisis driven of your political system that has not been able to take timely decisions?
You're right, because we have a problem with executive presidency. Executive president has too much powers who can intervene in economy and political decision making. What this government did when they came into power was they passed something called 20th Amendment to the Constitution. What it did was give back certain powers to the president, which were taken away by the previous amendment, 19th Amendment. So it further strengthened the powers of the president, and in turn it reduces the powers of the parliament, which was fairly a big concern. One of the root causes of the crisis, as some pointed out, one of the reasons that opposition constantly point out is it is very difficult for a government to function with an executive president, because the president has too much power. He can change the ministries in the way that he wants, and so on and so forth. So that has a big problem. And when you have one family that has the president, prime minister, finance minister, and all these important ministries under them, that also adds fuel to the
And
fire.
Umesh, does this current crisis that has now drawn people out on roads has adversely affected the life of common Sri Lankans? Is it hammering or denting the current political system? Is it a kind of a challenge for the current political regime?
It is definitely a challenge, because the demands of the people are very clear. They want president, and I think even the Rajapaksa family, to go home, or resign from their posts, because they insist on it. If you go to protest, you will see constantly they say go home, Gota, and slogans around this nature. So they want that change. People were not satisfied with some of the changes done by the government, including resignation of cabinet ministers, and they invited other parties to join. People are not satisfied with this. They want a real change. They are very clear. And yesterday there was a massive protest in Goldface and in front of Presidential Secretariat. Today, even amidst rain, a lot of people are keep protesting. These things are going on, and people are really insisting that they need change. And I don't think that they're going to be satisfied with minor changes here and there. It's very clear that they want president and prime minister in particular to resign.
Umesh, artificially holding of USD's value, do you think it is a major trigger? I have read this in one of the international articles recently published about the economy of Sri Lanka, that government was trying to hold value of Sri Lankan rupee against the US dollar, which actually became a problem that that blowed your currency away.
Yes, definitely. It's one of the major concerns that aggravated the crisis. What this did was this created an informal market, right? So it created an informal market. So a lot of people get used to this informal market, what you call hawala, or unofficial channels of sending dollars and receiving dollars. So that is not good for an economy. And government kept the exchange rate fixed for a very long period. So what it did was it allowed the people to settle down to these unofficial channels of receiving and sending dollars. Usually people would be quite reluctant to use these channels. They wouldn't always use it, but the government sort of pushed them into a position, particularly central bank actually pushed them into a position where they were compelled to use these unofficial channels, because the rates that were receiving from the banking system was very low. So that allowed that grey market, or the unofficial market, to grow, and that in turn resulted in significant reduction of workers' remittances coming to Sri Lanka. If you see 2021 figures, there were about 2 billion reduction compared to the previous year. Now, still, now the currency is floated, but now you can see currencies kept going up. One of the most, worst performing currencies in the world. This is because they did not float the rupee when it was supposed to, because they hold it for so long, and then when they let it go, they let it go without an interest rate hike
Umesh,
also. Resulted
Umesh,
in a
I'm now
significant.
again joined by Shahar Anees. Shahar, I hope I can hear you this time clearly. So, what is your take on the current crisis? Where do you think this crisis actually started to go out of equations, and then beyond that point, government couldn't catch hold of this of the things?
Uh, uh, Umesh will explain tax cuts. Can you all hear me clearly?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly.
Thank you. I think after what happened uh, due to COVID, central bank thought they should maintain lower interest rate, so they cut the interest rate toward lower. Not only that, they printed money in excess. So while keeping the interest rate low, they also
Shihar,
control.
Shihar, we are still having some lag in your voice, so I'll take you over the phone and let me go back to Umesh. Umesh, your closing comments on this entire situation. Where do you think this situation will now lead to? What do you think is going to happen in short term? Because, as I've said in my introduction, your government is looking for $17 billion, 10 billion in terms of trade deficit and 7 billion in terms of external loans. So where do you think the situation is leading to?
What we need, right? I mean, situation is quite bad. It is really bad, and we need to act immediately, because we now the discussions regarding debt restructuring and an IMF program has already started. So we need a stable government, and we need the political situation to be stabilized as soon as we can. Now we have a new central bank governor who seems to be very keen on getting on an IMF program. He was absolutely clear about it. So that's one positive thing. But that alone is not sufficient. The political change needs to happen that gives the political stability, right? So through having the political stability, you could continue the IMF negotiations and the debt restructuring negotiation. But the thing is, Sri Lanka's foreign currency reserves are at such a low point that Sri Lanka doesn't have much time at hand. So the negotiations, restructuring, all these things need to happen immediately, and it needs to happen parallelly to the political change,
Thank you.
rather
Thank you,
than you
Umesh.
can't wait.
Thank you, Umesh, for pointing this out. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Umesh Murabaduli from University of Colombo. And some important points he made are that the economy needs an entire restructuring. People in the country are just not happy with the way things are happening. I mean, the economy going out of proportions, the currency going out of hands, and people losing their purchasing power. The 13 hours power cut in a country that was primarily relying on the tourism industry. As he said, there was more than $4 billion Sri Lanka was earning before pandemic from its tourism industry. And soon as this money went out, there were problems that started brewing into the system. Government could not opt for IMF in time. That is one thing that he pointed out. And second thing that he said was the lack of a timely action for doing the financial reforms. The problem with institutions like International Monetary Fund is that when these organizations start their programs, they always bring in conditions that do not enjoy public support. And one of such conditions he mentioned was the tax revenue that needed to be increased, which the IMF believed is pretty much below the mark. I'm again joined by Shahar Anees. Shahar, you are now over the phone, and I need your take on the current financial crisis.
Okay, okay. So what happened was, I think Umesh told about the tax cuts. Then the government, because of the COVID-19, they reduced the interest rate to record low, something like 3.45 to 4.5. So the lowest rate was something like the people can borrow around 5%. And not only that, they also printed excess money. For the past, I think, since they came into power, they have printed something like 1.6 trillion rupees. So that all contributed to this, I think, the financial crisis. And also they had a policy that they won't go for foreign loans. Actually, it came because the rating agencies downgraded Sri Lanka's rating near to the default rate. So they were unable to go to the international capital market. So they were forced to rely on multilateral and bilateral loans plus swaps, central bank swaps. So they were running out of cash. So they had to pay the loans from the reserves. So that depleted the reserves, reduced the ability to defend the currency, and also reduced the amount of the dollars they had. So this all contributed to the crisis. Meanwhile, while the amount of the reserves were depleting, the central bank did a stupidest thing. They defended the currency. They kept the rupee at the same level, 200 rupees, and that allowed basically to a booming black market, which took the rupee to 220, 230, 240, and 250, which is 25% higher than the central bank rate. And people started to channel through this informal market. So that's, I think,
Shahad,
yeah.
just a quick question in the middle. What is the rate today? Because when we did the program last time, it was close to 200 and something. So what's the right now rate against
Okay.
USD?
On the Friday, the rate was 323, the bank rate, whereas if you go to a grey market rate, it's somewhere around 400 to 410 rupees.
So that means that on 1st of March, it was 200 rupees a dollar, and now in the open market, it's 400. So that's almost 100% devaluation of your currency. I mean, it's gone, lost half of its value on its face.
No, I think there are two rates here. One is the central bank rate. According to the bank rate, from 200 to 323, it's around 60% depreciation.
That's still a lot. 60%
Yes,
devaluation. Must have played
that's
a
right.
toll on the economy.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so moving forward, Shahar, one more important angle that I want to discuss in this program, taking advantage of your presence, is that in few international articles that I have read for this program, there is a direct correlation drawn between the Ukraine's war and the Sri Lanka's crisis. And the article further elaborated that most of the agriculture imports were coming from Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine now going off the international trade, Russia under sanctions. That has also played a phenomenal role. What are your thoughts on it?
I would say not significantly because the Russia and Ukraine. Russia is one of the strongest market for tea export, and plus both Russia and Ukraine in the recent past has been in the top list of the foreign arrivals or tourism. So basically, I mean, they were growing in terms of our trade and also tourism. But compared to the amount we had earlier, like now, if you think the wheat, we exported 45% of our wheat from I think Ukraine. But there were alternatives like Pakistan and India, and they could have actually kind of go to this alternative. But at the same time, I think tourism got really hit because soon after the end of the lockdown, they especially Sri Lankan authorities especially targeted Ukraine and Russian, and they started to come in large numbers, right? Earlier we were targeting Europe and high-end tourists, but whereas during the COVID time, because of their travel advisories, they did not come. So in terms of that, I think yes, given the lower dollar inflows to the country at the moment, what you are saying is correct. Our tourism is coming down because of the war has prevented Russians and Ukrainians coming as tourists. Plus, but some of the cheapest goods we are getting from those countries as imports. Plus, our exports are hit by the war.
Shahar, there are some international donor organizations as well as some countries that generously help countries in such hours of need. And many developing countries have taken advantage. There are institutions like Asian Development Bank, there are institutions like World Bank. There are international lenders like United States and European Union itself. Sri Lanka must have also tried to go for all these options. What I have heard so far is that only India has been able to reach for the rescue by contributing $2.5 billion. What's your take on it?
I think they started negotiations and discussions with the other multilateral organizations. The issue here was, the reforms, financial reforms, and some policy reforms, which the government was unable to put in place, in a form that you can easily negotiate for those loans. India has come, yes, that's true, but at the same time, there was a lot of dragged projects, or some of those projects like Trincomalee oil tank farm, and in the same district there was a power project. These are dragging for a long time. For instance, this Trincomalee oil tank farm that was signed actually in 2003, but it has been dragged for a long time. While Sri Lanka got the money, India also took what they want. I mean, these are kind of earlier they agreed, but for some reasons, and the agitation from the trade unions and the public, under the theme of it's like selling our.
Thank you very much, Shahar Anis, for being guest in my program. It was such a wonderful experience to have your insights on this issue. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with the second segment of the program. Stay with us.
الرحيم
لا أقسم بهذا البلد وأنت حل بهذا البلد ووالد وما ولد لقد خلقنا الإنسان في كبد أيحسب أن لن يقدر عليه أحد يقول أهلكت مالا لبدا أيحسب أن لم يره أحد ألم نجعل له عينين ولسانا وشفتين وهديناه النجدين فلاقتحم العقبة وما أدراك ما العقبة فك رقبة أو إطعام في يوم ذي مسغبة يتيما ذا مقربة أو مسكينا ذا متربة ثم كان من الذين آمنوا وتواصوا بالصبر وتواصوا بالمرحمة أولئك أصحاب الميمنة والذين كفروا بآياتنا هم أصحاب المشأمة عليهم نار مؤصدة.
Welcome back. As we discussed in our previous program as well, Pakistan's foreign policy has remained at the heart of the previous government's overall program that it had extended to revitalize and revamp many areas of governance for Pakistan. Pakistan's foreign policy remained very important and quite active in this period of time. In last 3 months, twice the members of OIC countries sent their delegations to Islamabad. Pakistan has also been able to once again raise the issue of Kashmir to United Nations, this time with far more force and fiercely. And more importantly, Pakistan was also taking the issue, was successful in taking the issue of Islamophobia and the issue of Palestine again to United Nations. When it comes to the issue of Palestine, there are more than 53 times that UN Security Council has struck down. United States has struck down resolutions in UN Security Council 53 times on the issue of Palestine. This said, the previous government's tenure has ended with a lot of hue and cry with regards to the foreign intervention of United States in Pakistan. New government coming in next few hours, maybe less than 24 hours. How will this affect Pakistan's foreign policy? I'm joined by Dr. Qandeel Abbas, who's an expert of international relations and foreign policy. Dr. Qandeel, I welcome you to my program.
Thank you very much, Shubha.
And you always are very enlightening. So once again, we are here with a lot of questions. How do you see Pakistan's performance in terms of its foreign policy during last 3.5 years?
During last 3.5 years, I think Pakistan remained very active in its foreign policy on both on regional and international levels. But our weak economy severely influenced our foreign policy activities because we were under the pressures of World Bank and IMF, and in most of our foreign policy objectives, we were not able to achieve those objectives despite having all those potentials. For example, we arranged a conference through OIC in Kuala Lumpur, but we were not able to join that conference because of disunity in the Muslim world and because of our weak economy. Similarly, most of our foreign policy activities evolved around Indian regional hegemonic design as well as Afghan crisis. But in both the cases, despite all those sacrifices, we were not able to convince America to have balanced approach towards regional issues. But altogether, I think despite limited resources, we were able to formulate balanced foreign policy towards different regional and international crises. And particularly recently when we formulated our national security policy, in that policy we have decided to move from geopolitical and geostrategic aspects of foreign policy to geo-economic aspects of our foreign policy objectives. I think following moving to geo-economic perspective can enhance our capacity to follow our foreign policy objectives.
Dr. Qandeel, since you also teach the subject, I want to ask this question in a theoretical context. So the way Pakistan has been in this region and the way American influence or American interest has increased with India, could Pakistan in an ideal world do any better? You just mentioned yourself that Pakistan played a pivotal role in the safe exit of United States from Afghanistan. Could Pakistan do anything different to be a better boy in books of United States in this region?
I think our foreign policy is already based on creating a balanced approach towards different regional and international issues, and particularly we followed this approach towards Afghanistan, and we wanted to create peace and stability in Afghanistan, but that was not compatible with American regional objectives. That is why America was not happy with the Pakistani role in Afghanistan particularly. Similarly, when we are having aggressive stance towards Indian hegemonic design, that is also not making happy uh, friends of India. I think we can rely more on our Muslim friends to enhance our capacity and capability in our regional and international scenarios.
And Dr. Kandil, you just pointed out that in India's interest and United States' interests are interwoven. Pakistan, you mentioned they were looking into Pakistan from the prism of Afghanistan. But now, since United States has gone away from Afghanistan, what is the major American interest in this region that Pakistan or some other country would like to address? Is this not a Chinese-centric interest that United States pursue in this region of South Asia?
Yes, of course, because now China is posing threats to United States sponsored world system on different levels, and China has invested around officially $46 billion, but around $60 billion in Pakistan under a CPEC projects, and similarly, China has signed a huge deal with Iran that is $400 billion deal. That is showing that China has very long-term designs about this region, and definitely America is feeling threatened about these designs. But I think we should not take it in biased manner because international structures are still under the influence of Western and American structures. For example, if we observe IMF or World Bank, still they are under the American influence. So China is not able to replace IMF or World Bank. However, I think we should try to prove CPEC as a game changer project. That should not be only our slogan, and we need to create balanced approach towards our China and Russia foreign policy as well as America and Western countries.
Dr. Kandil, despite best efforts made by the previous government, we could not build a lot of bridges with India. Former Prime Minister Imran Khan, when he won the election, the first speech that he made from his house, one of the important areas of his foreign policy that he underlined was to mend relationship with India. Our relationship, 3.5 years down the road, still remain hostile. So do you blame Pakistan's foreign policy for it, or do you believe that the Indian policy at the moment is so hostile in nature that there were very few options that Pakistan had?
I would again highlight that till the time our economy is weak, we will not be able to adopt proactive regional or international foreign policy because United States' strategic interest in South Asia are mostly and absolutely in favor of India, and their priorities are based on taking India as their regional policeman. Because they want to, on the one hand, they want to counter China, Russia, and on the other hand, Pakistan and other regional countries. So I believe that till the time U.S. strategic interests are biased in South Asia, we will not be able to establish positive contacts with India. And for this purpose, I think our choice to access to China and Russia can create balance of U.S. regional policy.
Dr. Kandil, an important point that you just mentioned is that United States' future belongs to, the future interest of United States belongs to India. India and United States are in a state of honeymoon since quite long, but many critics believe that this might not last very long. They give two reasons primarily. One is that India is primarily driven out of its own economic interest, and the other is that India can ill afford to take up a long-term hostility with China. That apparently is the primary interest of United States. So how long, as an expert, do you believe the bromance between India and United States might continue in the region?
I think they need each other, and we are failed to convince United States for balanced approach towards South Asia, especially when we are refusing any anti-Pakistani government in Kabul and pro-Indian government in Kabul that is in fact instigating both United States and India. But I think we don't have any other priority and we don't have any other choice to refuse any pro-Indian government in Afghanistan because all the history is filled with misuse of Afghan land against Pakistan, particularly during last 1 or 2 decades. We observed that by misusing Afghan soil, India is regularly trying to destabilize Pakistan. So I think we cannot compromise on our national interests, but at the same time we need to convince the United States to adopt a balanced approach if they want to pursue their regional interests positively.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kandil. It's always a luxury and privilege to have you in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Dr. Kandil from Kazim University. Few important points that he made with regards to Pakistan's foreign policy is that Pakistan's policy, the foreign policy, is primarily driven out of the economic interests of the country. And it's the economics that is going to decide the significance of this country going forward. He also highlighted that United States' interests in the region are more Chinese-centric, anti-Chinese-centric, and thereby Pakistan might not be of immense use for the United States. So he thereby does not anticipate a major shift in Pakistan's foreign policy. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.